Welcome to Bets on the Future, where we highlight the various career paths in the electrifying metals world. From the vehicle you ride in to the bridge holding it up, metals are everywhere. Why not in your career too? I'm Jennifer Betts, a metals industry veteran with almost 20 years experience, here to highlight these incredible career paths as told by the women who are living them. On this week of Bets on the Future, we have an incredible guest, somebody in the metals world that has really been groundbreaking and really, truly inspiring several new types of technology. And she has really been breaking ground in some new areas that we're going to dive into shortly. Megan O'Connor, Ph.D., is the co-founder and CEO of Nth Cycle, a company revolutionizing the critical metals refining industry through innovative electro-extraction technology. Under her leadership, Nth Cycle enables sustainable domestic production of essential metals like nickel and cobalt, which are vital to U.S. technological advancement in areas like clean energy, defense, and consumer technology. Drawing from her environmental engineering doctorate from Duke University, Megan has led Nth Cycle to secure over $60 million in investments from entities like Clean Energy Ventures and MassMutual, while earning grants from the Department of Energy and National Science Foundation. Named to Forbes 30 Under 30 and Grist 50, Megan continues to shape the future of metals refining for a secure and sustainable industrial supply chain. Welcome, Megan O'Connor, PhD, to Bets on the Future. Thank you, Megan, for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to sit down and chat a little bit about what you've been working on lately.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jennifer. It's great to be here today.
I'm really excited to talk to you because you have a really fascinating background, and what you've been working on has been an area that we really haven't explored on this particular podcast because it's, I'll say it's a little niche, but very much needed in the metals world. And for those who are not familiar with Nth Cycle, can you go into little detail about kind of where it fits into the metals supply chain, if you will?
Absolutely. So at Encycle, we call ourselves a critical metal refining company. And so, yes, we're very focused on turning things like ore and even recycled materials back into usable critical minerals for the energy transition. And so we work with scrap recyclers on the recycling side of the value chain. And in the future, we want to work with mining companies up at the front end of the value chain to chemically refine all of the things that they have, again, into those things like cobalt, nickel, copper, the rare earth metals for manufacturing here domestically and in the Western world in general. Because right now, most of that actually happens overseas in Asia.
Now, I'm very curious. This is something that probably is not really in a lot of children's books growing up. So I'm kind of curious, how did this come about? Like, how did this spark your interest? How did you get into this area? How did this become your focus in school?
Yeah, on my kindergarten intake form, I definitely did not write wants to be a critical metal refining company CEO one day. My journey was not linear, as I don't think many people's is, but I went to undergraduate for environmental chemistry. So I'm an environmental chemist by training. Really loved doing all things chemistry. Definitely have loved science my whole life. But when I was in the lab doing my undergraduate thesis and working on like all these like small molecule type things in chemistry, I wanted to work on something more that would have a shorter term impact, right? Because if you develop a new chemical, it takes upwards of 20 years to see that impact in industry. And so, all right, how can I use my chemistry background and still do all this environmental chemistry work, but do it at a scale and a speed which could have a shorter term impact? And so I had a lot of advisors who said, you should go get your PhD in environmental engineering, right? Much larger scale. You can still use your background. So that's what I went to do. And so when I was working on my project as a PhD student, it was actually a project in oil and gas. Um, It was looking at how to mitigate and pull out different contaminants from hydraulic fracturing wastewater. Was interested in that project, but didn't want to be in traditional energy. Like clean energy, right? You had heard that term, and this was 15 years ago. And I was like, okay, clean energy is such a broad umbrella. And so as I started to dig in to think about like, do I want to change projects? Is this the direction that I want my career to go in? Critical minerals kept coming up over and over again as like in my own terms, like the new building blocks of this economy. And I said, wow, like how come more people don't realize this? These metals are such an important part of our transition. And B, like it was very clear to me that we didn't have a very secure supply of them. And so a couple things happened at the same time. One, I met my co-founder, Chad Vasitas, who was a full-time professor at Harvard. I simply saw him give a talk at an academic conference on this amazing technology that he developed, the one that we actually have commercialized here at Nth Cycle now. But he developed it for a completely different application in wastewater treatment. And like that day, I was like, wow, this guy's super smart. Really didn't think anything else of it at the time. Flash forward 3 months, I found myself in a meeting called, it was like a Green Electronics Summit, I think was the actual name of it. And it was folks like Apple and Dell and all the major consumer electronics companies in a room. And it was fascinating because they were talking about the sustainability issues they saw coming down the line over the next 5 to 10 years. And again, this was back in 2015 when these events all started to occur in my life. And over again, these folks kept saying the same two things, no matter what company was speaking. The first thing that they were worried about was, wait, how are they going to dispose of all this waste, right? They all joked at like, we have cell phones and we have laptops that we manufacture and we have a massive e-waste problem. Imagine when electric vehicles start coming off the road and wind turbines and solar panels, right? They're just much larger forms of electronics waste and we have no way to manage that. And the second problem they all said was we don't have enough of these critical minerals. We, again, use very small volumes of things like cobalt. And we're having an issue now with having a secure supply of these and knowing where this supply is actually coming from in terms of traceability. Imagine when electric vehicles and solar panels and wind turbines start to become more prevalent and they use orders of magnitude more of these critical minerals, right? Like the supply chains are only going to become more strained. And so I walked out of that meeting feeling like, A, like angry that we were making the same mistakes that we had made in the past with the energy industry in general. And then B, I felt inspired of like, okay, I wonder if technology could help fix this problem. Like, could we take all this waste that we will be generating with all this new technology that we're developing and turn it into something usable again, like get a secondary source of these critical minerals here domestically or whatever country you're in to create a really robust supply chain of these materials so that we aren't at risk of not being able to transition because of a supply chain problem. And so that was the day that I thought back to Chad's technology and thought, I wonder if you could just apply this to metal refining with the feedstock or the thing coming in being the recycled materials. And I actually switched my PhD project that day with my third co-founder was my PhD advisor. And so I walked into her office and I said, Desiree, I really don't want to work on this oil and gas project anymore. I'm in my third year. So folks out there who've gotten a PhD know that switching a project in your third year is like PhD suicide. But I did it anyway because I felt very passionate about doing this. And I said, like, I don't know if this is going to work. Chad was like, I think it will work. Let's do it. And so I was the student to take it and just flip it for the application. And 3 years later, no, 2.5 years later, I guess, I was graduating. It was the summer of 2017. And we all sat down at a bar in Harvard Square and said, like, we really think this could be something. And I wanted to at least try to commercialize this technology, thinking it could have a really big impact for the space. And so that was 7 years ago. And we just opened up our first commercial system is now operational in Ohio. So it's been a journey, but that's how I got into metal refining and entrepreneurship when I actually have nobody in my family anywhere near metals. They still don't think I understand what I do. But when I sit down at like Thanksgiving or the holiday dinners, but it was a fun journey to be on so far.
I just got really filled with a lot of anxiety when you said that you switched year three of your doctorate program because that, yes, I'm familiar with that. It's not typical. And kudos to your advisor for, for not telling you no.
She was like, "There's a lot of risk with this," and she was great. She was like, "Here's all the things that could go wrong." I was like, "It's fine." Like, if it takes me an extra year, it takes me an extra year. But I was able to get it done in the 5.5-ish mark, so it all worked out in the end.
5.5-ish mark. Yes. Well, obviously, it's been beneficial that It didn't stop you. It didn't stop your team, your co-founders, and it's come to fruition. And the facility in Ohio is running. That's huge from that perspective. To think back, what, a decade from when you walked out of that meeting with just that feeling of frustration, that thinking of all of the EVs, the giant electronics, if you will, that were coming down the pipeline
Yeah.
with really no real way to recycle them at that point, to get those critical minerals, to your point, back into the supply chain. Because we have them from an urban mining standpoint, we have them, we have the materials. Just at that point, a decade ago, we didn't have your technology available to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And refining, while it is like it seems so niche, right, is like one of the pieces that it's like the most critical gap according to the Department of Energy of what we need to actually get if we just think about lithium ion batteries. So the batteries that power like electric vehicles and the things that are in our cell phones, any lithium ion battery, right? The piece that we're missing here to have that supply chain, like the biggest gap is really in the refining piece. And that's where Ncycle is trying to help create that solution of how do we do this domestically so that whether we're mining new materials or recycling these that are coming off the road, we have a way to chemically turn them back into things that are usable again here on US soil.
So when you graduated and it was time to turn this into a viable commercial business, did you run up against some roadblocks when you were going to those funds, trying to raise? This is a pretty unique, at that time, probably unheard of technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think critical minerals for at least like in the 7 years that I've been in the space, it wasn't really thought of as part of the clean energy transition, right? You look at like traditional climate funds, whether they were started 10 years ago or 2 years ago, and critical minerals are now starting to become part of what they invest in. But for a long time, people, because it's a really hard industry, right? It's very fragmented. Again, we haven't had a lot of the pieces of that supply chain or value chain here in the US or even in the Western world, even in Europe, right? And that's part of the problem is that like it's very hard to understand how all of the different pieces of this value chain come together. And so it's only been very recently where you started to see a lot of money coming into the space, partly from the US government. And then I think the private has followed that. But some of the challenges were folks just didn't understand where critical minerals fit in or understood how we could help solve this issue by creating a domestic way to refine materials. So it was challenging from a story perspective. I think people understood that more critical minerals were needed. I think it was really hard for folks to understand how that was going to happen, right, from an execution perspective. And so there's a lot of folks in the space now. Again, I think it's getting the attention it deserves, but a lot of it was like me pounding my fist on the table, like, you don't understand how big this problem is. Like, all of these other technologies that are being built, like, won't exist without critical minerals, right? Like, these are actually the building blocks to get us to transition away from fossil. And so a lot of it has been just getting people to understand where the pain points are, why they're the pain points, why the model that works over in Asia isn't the model that's going to work here in the Western world for various reasons. And so those are some of the challenges that we faced, really just like getting the education piece down and getting folks up to speed of why this is such a big issue and how, right, we can think we can fix it and why, hardware is how we're going to fix it, right? Because there's a number of different ways you could look at this, but, we feel strongly without new technology, you won't be able to solve this issue. And so we're lucky now that a lot of people have their eyes in this space and have realized what a big problem this is and that technology can play a really big role. But yeah, it was difficult in the beginning.
Yeah, I can imagine going into those meetings trying to explain the technology behind it, but also the problem. It's something this industry has a bit of a problem with in terms of not being really at the forefront of the masses, not really being, I guess, people aware of how much recycling goes on behind the scenes, but then like to break it down even more into the very particular metals, critical minerals, like really going into the minute details of it and then where they come from and the issues behind where they come from. And
Yeah.
mm, That
Yeah,
probably is very challenging.
it was, and it's like the sourcing challenges, right? It's not just geopolitical, right? There's so many layers that make it a complex issue that, yeah, it just took a while, I think, for folks to realize how big of a problem it really was and for critical minerals to get the attention that I've noticed needed, but a lot of people weren't giving it. So I feel fortunate that we're in the space and that we've been able to sort of help bring the story to the forefront of, I guess, climate tech.
Yes. So there are some sector specific questions that I wanted to get to for what Nth Cycle is working on. And y- your technology works in a variety of ways. I know we've talked a little bit about clean energy and a little bit on the consumer electronic side, but I'm curious on the military side of things as well. Can you elaborate a little bit about how your technology works in the military space?
Yeah, absolutely. So as the metal refining technology, we partner with both recycling companies and mining companies. So we go on site with them, which is part of the uniqueness and novelty of our system is that it's so modular that it can actually go on site, say at like just a scrap yard as an example, right? And the scrap companies will have a mix of different inputs or different feedstocks, as we call it in industry. They could be spent lithium ion batteries that are coming out of consumer cars or cell phones. They could have the magnets, and the magnets are like in your headphones or in your cell phone as like the receiver or the speaker, and then they actually power electric vehicle motors. And so these scrap companies will get, from a logistics perspective, all these different materials in. We go on site with them. We chemically refine all those different components back into the metals and then the military, can actually take those and can put them into our defense systems. And so a lot of the same metals that are used in your, average cell phone or EV are actually also used in a lot of different weapons or system, really anything that the military uses, which is why critical mineral supply chain stability is such a national security risk, right? It's not just for the energy transition for all of these technology that I just mentioned, but it's also a lot of what's used in the military, as you said. So it's really from a supply perspective that we work with those folks, not necessarily on the front end of where we get the recycled materials, but who we can actually sell to or have our materials used on the other side.
That's really quite fascinating. I recently learned a statistic on the aluminum side that I thought was very interesting, tied to the national security, where the UBCs, the used aluminum beverage cans that just went to the landfill each year, the magnesium in the aluminum alloy for those cans, the magnesium in those cans alone would be sufficient enough to supply the national needs for the United States versus what we import every single year. And that would go towards supporting some of our national defense needs. And so, what you're discussing about refining some of what we already have existing here and that going into our military needs is kind of mind blowing that we already have these things. And yet, we haven't been utilizing what we have because we didn't have the technology at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Over 90% of our critical minerals are sent overseas to be refined, whether they're like if that source is from recycled materials or even mined ore. And we don't do a ton of mining here in the US, as I'm sure lots of folks listening know. But even if we do, it's sent overseas to be refined, right? And so we're losing all that really valuable material and then having to import it all again once it's refined. And so, yeah, this is the piece that keeps it here. We can refine it here, we can use it here, so we can reduce our reliance on those imports.
So, when you're talking about your ability to be mobile and move, I'm just kind of curious about how quickly can you move? How often do you like to move? The process? Is this like every week? Do you like to move it once a month? Like what kind of timeline are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And because a lot of folks, a lot of different recyclers or refiners in the space all define modularity differently. And so when we talk about modularity, we really think of it from a volume perspective. And so while our systems can be moved, right, and they're designed, if a project were to finish, we can move the equipment to another project. But when we talk about modularity, it's really going on site with a partner. We hope minimum 5 years, we shoot for 10 years or longer. And it's really in the volume that we talk about modularity. And so the issue with the way that we refine metals today overseas is that they're large centralized facilities. Think like multiple US football fields in size. They're massive and they're upwards of $2 to $4 billion in some cases to actually build one of these refineries out. And that model works really well when you have a really long life mine and you have a really large mine, which is what you'd see typically overseas, right? So you can justify the cost and the time that it takes to build one of these facilities because you have that large mining asset next to it. A lot of the peers in the space in the US with us are trying to basically copy that model and take a big, large centralized refinery and stick it down here and use it for recycling. We feel strongly that model will not work here. A, because if you think about cell phones and laptops and even electric vehicles, wind turbines, right? They're not all magically in one place, right? So transporting all of that material to one centralized facility just doesn't make sense from an economic perspective, nor from a carbon perspective. Um, the second issue is these large refineries, as I mentioned, are built for usually one mine, right? And so it's a very specific, like narrow band of materials that it's used to seeing. And so for recycling too, right? Like not all of these batteries look the same, right? It's a very diverse set of inputs. And so it's really hard to make that model work in a space that like just logistically is all over the place. And then two, has a very diverse set of inputs. And so that's what we say when we talk about modularity is that A, from a volume perspective, we can go on a partner site and process just the volume that we have, right? We don't have to build out this massive facility and then maybe only use 10% of it, right? So that it's hard to justify those economics. We can build to the volumes that our partners have and then add to it over time, right? So if you want to get to say 100,000 metric tons per year, but you start with 10, we can start with 10 and then scale with you as a partner facility versus having sort of stranded capacity for 10 years as you try to get up to that full capacity that you were looking at to begin with. And then we're able to process the diversity of feedstocks that you see in this space, which is the other way we think about modularity is we're not set to a specific type of material. We can move and not just do lithium ion batteries as an example. We can do other types of nickel scrap as well, because even if we recycled 100% of lithium ion batteries over the next, say, 5, 10 years, it actually doesn't get us enough nickel, as an example, to meet demand or projected demand. And so where do we get all that other nickel? You have to recycle more materials and you have to mine more materials, right? And so the reason that Nth Cycle has this, much higher level view than just being a battery recycler is because more metal is needed and not just cobalt and nickel, but we need copper, rare earths, we need all of the critical minerals. And so that's how we define modularity here at Nth Cycle is it's not just one feedstock that needs refining. It's not just one metal that needs refining. It's unfortunately a very large problem. And so we're trying to fix it by having that sort of modular solution that can fit with the various partners along this very fragmented value chain.
It's a really interesting approach because most of the public are very much unaware of those supply chain issues. And if they are aware of lithium ion batteries, for instance, they're probably not aware of what you alluded to, that there are other products that have some of those raw materials that we still need, that it's not just a one stop fix all for recycling one product, right? To fix everything, that you can't just recycle that one product and then, oh, okay, we're done. We fixed it. And so it's very interesting that your process allows for that adaptability for the different types of raw materials that would need to come through to be able to essentially, I call it urban mining or refining. Urban refining? Is that maybe a new term? Perhaps we'll
Like,
call it that.
we'll coin that.
We'll coin that. Of the different products that are gonna be coming through to be able to help supplement for the growing demands of how many more iPhones are we gonna we're up to 16 now?
Yeah. And a lot of, like you said, a lot of consumers don't realize like the inside doesn't usually ever look the same, right? That's why they come out with these new versions that can do all the things that from a consumer side, like are great. But if you look at the actual chemistry inside, like they project it's going to continue to change, right? The amount of cobalt compared to the amount of nickel, which like again, to the average person, like isn't meaningful, right? And it shouldn't be, but it is meaningful and it's hard for a recycler and a refiner to deal with that change, right? So if you imagine like every 10 years, what's coming into your facility has to change. And from the chemistry perspective, like that's traditional technology has a really hard time with that, which is why recycling has been so hard to do, right? And so that's why we don't do any of it here. Like the recyclers that we have in the US typically have been legally allowed to collect and then export a lot of this material overseas. And so that's really what we're trying to solve for is how do we combat the ever-changing types of materials that we have to figure out a way to refine and recycle? And how do we do that in a way that makes sense with the types of materials that we have, the commodity cycles that everyone in this space is all too familiar with, especially in nickel right now. And so, how do you create a model and how do you build a technology that can solve all those things? And that's really what we've done here and are trying to do here at Nth Cycle.
Something that doesn't get enough attention too is the new products that are being designed. They're not being designed with end of life in mind, which is a real struggle because companies like yours are quickly having to adapt to the products that are constantly coming out without that mindset of, okay, well, how are you actually going to deal with it when it gets tossed or put into the recycling supply chain? And I don't necessarily have an answer on how do you fix that because the companies that are starting to design are obviously looking for the largest gross profits. They're looking for revenue, they're looking for that aspect of things and not necessarily for the how do we make sure that it's the easiest way to recycle it and put it back into a circular economy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a challenge. And we at Nth Cycle, we're not the recycling piece. So our partners are the recyclers who like collect the stuff. And then right now, like you said, they're not easy to disassemble. Right now, it has to be done manually by humans because it's everything like looks different, right? So people are trying to automate this somehow, but it's really hard when you have, I don't know, 5, 7 different types of phones, if not the batteries inside the phones that look different and how to sort those automatically. And so people doing it are doing it right now. And most of the time it's just shredded, right? So think about like a very large, like paper shredder. That's what they use for batteries, at least. And it just, they chuck all the different types of batteries in there. It's sometimes they're separated, sometimes they're not. It really depends on the recycling company. But yeah, it's a challenge, especially when we start to get all these other types of clean energy technologies that come off the road or out of consumers' hands or whatever it might be out of commission. Because yeah, it's they're a very diverse set of materials and every manufacturer does it slightly differently, right? And they are definitely not thinking about how do we make this easier for the recycler or even the refiner, right? Because for us, we care more about the chemistry because our partners take care of the physical disassembly and shredding, but it is definitely a challenge and will become a bottleneck in the future.
Well, on that note, I want to talk a little bit about the upstream investment and the supply chain resilience. What makes Nth Cycle's refining technology an essential piece for building a resilient and secure domestic supply chain?
Yeah, so I think you've seen a lot of investment in and I guess chatter about the other pieces of the supply chain, whether it's the actual like if we talk about just about batteries for a second, like the actual manufacturing of the cathode, which goes into the battery, or the actual manufacturing of the battery, or the manufacturing of the car once the battery's made, right? All these different steps, which again are all very much needed, right? We need all of these pieces because we haven't done really any of it in the US for a very long time, maybe a few pieces. But then I think a lot of people forget about the front end of like, where do all those materials, not just minerals and metals like we do, but all the other types of materials and all the other components that go into that end EV that you see as a consumer, where does all that stuff come from? And so we're starting to see investments in that space. But where we fit in again is like you have, whether you're getting the cobalts and the nickel or the different metals in the batteries coming from a recycled good or from a mine itself, there is no refining capacity in the US right now. There is none except for the Nth Cycle system that just came online in Ohio. So we're very excited to be the first refiner of a product called nickel MHP, which is very specific unless you're in the in this space. But it's a form of nickel that's used in a variety of clean energy industries. But up until we had the system commissioned, there was no commercial production of that type of material here, or you had to get it from overseas. And so again, that bottleneck of just how you turn whether it's mined material or recycled material into something usable again, that's like the critical bottleneck that we're trying to solve to get this supply chain, right? To really have that full circular economy and to have the reduced reliance that we need and that we want, not just as a country, but this half of the world is really what we're trying to do here at Nth Cycle.
Wow. And I can imagine the demand for the product that comes out of that facility in Ohio, you're probably having no issues moving that since there's no other domestic source for it. Because I can imagine the consumers of that product are probably looking for domestic sources and recycled sources and being able to say that they're using more of that particular product in their products.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to see different parts around the world start to care about things like this. Like as an example, right, the EU and the battery passport, right? You have to reduce your carbon footprint by X percent. And so a lot of that is tracked from how the minerals were mined and processed, right? So there's parts of the world where the processes they use are so carbon intensive that they actually cannot now be used in the European Union because they're just too high. And so, yeah, the reduction in carbon footprint that we get for our materials is really big. And then, yeah, from a US perspective, right, with the Inflation Reduction Act, where and how it was processed matters a lot to them. And making sure it's from a recycled material and then that it's produced in either in the US or a country that we have a fair trade agreement with, which is not many, I should say, for things like nickel. So,
So to switch gears a little bit, because we are getting a little bit close to time on the podcast, because I do want to be respectful of time, even though I have many more questions to ask. But I do want to hit a little bit on the business side of things. I am a bit curious about how the transition was for you to go from academia into the CEO seat, into the entrepreneurial path. Was it challenging? Was it something that came natural to you? Was it something that seemed like it would happen? Would it not happen? Let me know what seemed to transpire after you got that diploma from
yeah,
graduation.
I'll say, as I said, I never thought about entrepreneurship. I don't have anyone in my family that's an entrepreneur, nor do I have anyone in the metal space in my family. And I went to school, I got my degree in chemistry and I went to grad school and to get my PhD, knowing I didn't want to go down the two very traditional paths a PhD would, right? You either become a professor and stay in academia, or you go work for some very traditional, in my case, like energy business. I knew I didn't want to go down either of those paths, but I did it anyway because I wanted to be in an environment where I was allowed to and was encouraged to like think of new ideas and build cool technology, right? And so that's really what I set out to do in my PhD. And I sort of like, as I mentioned earlier, like all of these things sort of coincided of meeting my co-founder and seeing this event happen with all the folks at the consumer electronics companies. And I sort of just put two and two together and good at and loved the communicating science to people part, right? Like the communication piece. I never really knew what that would look like because you go and you PhD and you you don't really meet a lot of people who have gone off and not become professors or stayed in industry. And so when this opportunity presented itself, I sort of leaned into that piece of it, right? Of like, as I mentioned earlier, like trying to educate people on why this is an important issue and how we think we can fix it and why our model we think will work better than what's out there today. And so really leaning into the communication piece, which is a huge part of the role, and then adapting over time. And so, yeah, it's definitely been challenging. I think any first time founder you meet they wear, 87 hats at one time. And so hopefully you start to pull more of those hats off as the team grows. But one of the things that I tried to do from early on was just know what I'm good at and know what I'm not good at. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs and especially CEOs have a hard time doing that, of identifying like, hey, I'm not really particularly good at this. And there are people out there who can do it a lot better. And I tried to hire those people. Like those are the first hires I made, right? My CFO is one of the first major hires I made. And he's phenomenal at his job, right? And I'm not, you will never see me be a CFO, but that's okay, right? Because I think building the right team and finding people who are phenomenal at what they do is part of the role of being CEO. And I think why businesses are successful is they find the right people, right? Because you could have the best technology in the world, but it's never going to see the light of day if you don't have the right team around you to execute on what you need to do to get it to that point. And so that's really what I focused on in this role. And so far, I really enjoy it. And of course, as I said, there's ups and downs, but building the team, communicating to the world what we're doing and why I think at least it's so exciting, why people should be excited about it is my favorite part of the role. So that's sort of how I got here in my transition to it.
Well, so speaking kind of on the transition side of things, you've received some awards on that note, and one of them was the Forbes 30 under 30. Awards like that, the Forbes 30 under 30, have they influenced your path at all? And would you have any advice for people looking to enter tech heavy industries along those lines?
Yeah, I think the awards are always great recognition of the hard work that not just me, but the company is doing, right? Like I said, it's definitely a community effort of building a company, especially a hardware company. It's like in a different category, in my opinion. And I would say again, my advice to any entrepreneur coming into the climate space or hardware space or whatever umbrella you stick us in, right, is find that community, right? You find the people who believe in what you're doing and believe in you and what you're trying to build. And that's how we found success is finding the right people at the right moments in time. And always, like I said, just being very open about who you are and what your role is in the company and what you're good at and evolving, right? Because your role is going to evolve over time and you can't get stuck in one place. And I think just being really focused on the people. I think a lot of people and a lot of teams forget about that piece. It's like it's people building this business, and that would be my advice: is like find the right mentors, find the right cheerleaders, find that community, and that includes investors, right? The people who work with you, the people who work around you, and really build that community around you because it does take a village to build a successful business, not just in this industry, but in this environment as well. And so that would be the biggest piece of advice I have to anyone out there who's looking to start a company, join a company, invest in a company. I feel strongly that's like the key to winning here.
I'd 100% agree with that. I wish I had that advice a little earlier on in my career, to be honest. That would have been very useful a few years ago, for sure. Before we head out, is there any topic, any advice, anything that we haven't touched on that you want to take a few minutes to take just before we head out?
I think I could talk all day about critical minerals, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time listening to this podcast. No, I would just say like Nth Cycle is trying to break down barriers and redefine what a critical metal refining company looks like, which I know is very niche, but also trying to redefine what a company in this space looks like, right? I don't think it's common to see a female CEO. I don't think it's common to see a very diverse team behind that CEO. And so we're always hiring, we're always looking for team members. And I know a lot of climate tech companies are in the same space as we are. So please, I encourage you, if you're thinking about hopping into the space, please do it because we need as many people as we can trying to solve all these really big issues. And critical minerals is a big one, but it's one of many. And so I will leave it at that.
And for those that are interested in finding out more about Ncycle and connecting with Megan O'Connor, the best way is Ncycle's website as well as Megan O'Connor's LinkedIn, perhaps is the best way to get a hold of you or connect with you. We can put that in the podcast description below. I almost said like and subscribe below, like my YouTube son's obsession. But we'll put it in the description below. And I just want to say thank you so much, Megan. I've learned a lot. It's been really fascinating. I really appreciate everything that you and your team have been working on developing. Thank you again to Desiree, your advisor who believed in you year 3 to change your PhD midstream. So
She's the real hero.
yes, really, truly appreciate that and everything that you've been working on and continued much success and additional locations for Ncycle because it is something that is greatly needed for critical minerals and beyond for everything that we're working on in that area.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Megan O'Connor, co-founder of Nth Cycle, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today.
Thank you.